One problem I have with this is that it seems like basically anything that the West does or is said to do can in some vague way be traced back to the Bible or the Christian tradition in one way or another. Now, if that's not the case, because that would be a little bit too weak of a principle, what would be a falsifying condition? Like, if there was something that were true in the West, something that people did, something that people accepted morally, is there an example of such a thing that would make you say, okay, that's not grounded in Christianity?
I want to show you part of the discussion between Alex O'Connor and Glen Scrivener in the program Uncommon Ground, moderated by Justin Brierley, which is a whole discussion on the book that Glen wrote it in regards to also the book of Tom Holland called Dominion, and the discussion that Western culture and Western civilization has in its history this Christian emphasis and influence on its values, on its culture. And Alex is very much opposed to that, not only because of what he defends, but also because he wants to understand more. And you see that he's always questioning. He has this Socratic position of always questioning and trying to dive more in depth of what Glen is arguing. But the point that I want to bring here is when Alex asks if Glen's argument can be falsifiable, right? And in this case, tested. And let's see here their discussion. I'm gonna.
Can I ask you a question? One problem I have with this is that it seems like basically anything that the West does or is said to do can in some vague way be traced back to the Bible or the Christian tradition in one way or another. Now, if that's not the case, because that would be a little bit too weak of a principle, what would be a falsifying condition? Like, if there was something that were true in the West, something that people did, something that people accepted morally, is there an example of such a thing that would make you say, okay, that's not grounded in Christianity? Yep. In a way that you don't think I could pull a similar trick of sort of saying, yeah, but this biblical story or this church tradition or whatever, can you think of an example of something society could be doing that would disallow you, that would falsify the idea that it's Christian in origin?
So this is actually the difference between me and Tom, which is not the difference that you identified. The difference between me and Tom is for me to be able to say, I think there is a Christianity beyond which we have developed ideas, and we've developed ideas with Romanticism, for instance. Yeah. Again, Romanticism is unthinkable without this tradition of the person that's come, through the scriptures and through meditation on the persons of the Trinity, and there's definitely some very Christian backstory to the individual. We invented the individual, Larry Seidenthop's great book, but we've also invented individualism. We've got this intense first personal sense that I think has turned into a romanticized kind of self, and takes the West in all sorts of directions contra to what the Bible is. So I'm not trying to make the point that, it's easy to say the modern West is very pro-gay and the Bible's very anti-gay, and I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that, because if I said that to you, if I said, the LGBT movement is anti-Bible, you could say, yeah, but the motivations behind the LGBT movement are essentially Christian. What I'm saying is, can you think of a single example of something the West could be doing that would make you say, actually, no, that's definitely not Christian? Industrial scale abortion?
Okay, right. So if, and you don't think the West is doing that?
It's totally doing that.
So when you say that,
that's not very Christian.
So when you say that Western civilization, warts and all, is indebted to Christianity, this is an example of a massive part of modern Western culture, which has got nothing to do with Christianity. It's actually contra Christianity.
100%.
But many people, if you ask people on the street, I think popular consensus, especially in the UK, is that abortion is fine, at least up to a certain point. It seems to be a settled issue here.
Yeah.
So the air that those people are breathing is profoundly un-Christian.
Which I say in the book. And what I say in the book is, what's fascinating at that point is that they are doing what is I would consider to be a pagan practice for some profoundly Christian reasons. And it's healthcare, right? It's about bodily autonomy.
But look, I asked you a second ago for an example of something which you would say is not and not an example of a flourishing of Christianity. You said industrial abortion.
Yep.
When I said, well, that means it's not Christian, you said, but they're actually doing a very Christian thing.
No, they're not doing a Christian thing.
You said that they're motivated by Christian principles.
No, I don't think they're motivated by Christian principles. I just think the way you are able to forward some quite pagan ends in a modern society, and there's lots of pagan stuff that we do, you do tend to have to use some Christian language in order to do it, or Christian-ish language in order to do something profoundly un-Christian.
Okay, so once again then, like we've sort of landed on this thing, industrial abortion, which you say that to buttress in Western civilization, you need to use Christian language. What I'm looking for is a falsifying condition then, something which the West could be doing, which you could not make that argument for. It seems like it doesn't matter what you point to. The fact that you can point to like the gay rights movement, to feminism, even to industrial abortion, and still say that, ultimately, there's some Christian influence going on here. That makes me think
you're mischaracterizing me there. You're mischaracterizing me there quite substantially there. I think it's a totally pagan practice, which we are heading full steam towards. I think euthanasia is another kind of pagan practice that it is utterly in keeping with paganism, not in keeping with Christianity. But even the reasons that are given for it, some of them are starting to be reasons, such as, well, the NHS is creaking at the seams, and this might be cheaper. Some of those sorts of justifications are being given, which are pagan kinds of justifications for pagan kinds of practices. But you're looking for falsifiability when we're not talking about science. Okay, so falsifiability works brilliantly if you've got population A, population B, and a control group, and let's run the experiment, and let's look at the results, and we'll ABC test it. Okay, you cannot do that with the past. You literally, we look back at the past. There is not A, B, or C past. There is only A, and that A has been 20 centuries of some very profound Christianization, and we've come out the other end of 20 centuries of very strong Christianization. And the extraordinary thing is that so many people are able to think of Tom Holland's thesis as wild, or, it's an incredibly modest thesis, which I think is quite obvious. And it's quite obvious to everyone else around the world. When everyone else comes to the UK, they're just like, well, I've come to a Christian country, haven't I?
You think that?
Now, what I find it interesting with atheists is that they work to prove that God doesn't exist, even though they are going after the absolute. I don't know if you ever notice, but every time that they want an answer for their questions, they want an absolute answer. And it is ironic because God is the absolute. So they're trying to reach God through other means that are not the common means to reach God. That is mostly in a scientific / philosophical / neuroscientific / I don't know what else, more ways to find the absolute. And even when it's presented to them in a mysterious and kind of like we cannot fully grasp everything, they still don't accept. They still want something that they can grasp. So it is a lot of a selfish worldview position of projecting their own questions, their own doubts, and their own uncertainty in the world, and putting science as the God for them, even though science in itself doesn't produce absolute results. And in this point, I'm going to talk about their debate on trying to have a falsifiable argument. And Glen saying that you cannot do that with history. It's not science. You're not trying to produce a result through a controlled test, just like science does. And even the results of those testings when you see it, what science brings in practice, it is not 100%. There is a percentage there. It is a probabilistic kind of testing. And yes, it is falsifiable because of that, because it's not 100%. And I see that Alex, throughout the whole debate, he was trying to have a absolute answer of things that Glen was bringing for him through his Christian perspective, which is where he's grounded. Now, the point that I want to argue here, and that I find it interesting in Christianity, is our capability of revising history and revising the past in a way to extract what is good and what is not. So it's to have a moral common ground, or a common ground in morality. And that is because Christ himself brings us this point in Christianity to look at history with him as the center of the history itself, and extracting through his examples and his teachings what is morally wrong and what is morally right, and perceive in human history the practices that brought a corrupted way of life, just like abortion and euthanasia that Glen was bringing as an example. Even if the moral intuition that they are having are Christians, still their practices are corrupted practices. Even in revision of the Hebrew practice in the Old Testament, bringing forth what is good and what is not. And that is particularly Christian, as we see here in the Gospel of Jesus according to John chapter 8, verses 54 to 58, when Christ, in his defense of his testimony, says, in the end, very truly I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am. So it brings us the question. Christ is saying that he exists or existed before the world itself, before Abraham. So wait a second, let us see in history, through the Bible, through the Old Testament, where are the evidence for that, where we can notice connections that are happening, of events that are happening in the Old Testament that connects directly to Christ as the Messiah. Because he even says in verse 56, your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. So Christ is saying that Abraham had and has this connection with him, Jesus. And the point of being able to see how we can extract from the Old Testament and from history itself the positions that can be morally wrong and morally right are also extracted from Christ himself as an example, because further on in his gospel according to John chapter 15, verses 21 to 25, Christ is talking about that. And specifically verse 22 here, he is saying, if I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. So Christianity, even though throughout history was wrongfully used to justify morally wrong acts, that's something that Christians are saying as well. Because our religion, Christianity, gives us the capacity to revise history in a moral perspective bound to God and discuss what is morally wrong and what is morally right according to Christ himself where we are grounded. And this is remarkable because I don't see any other religion that allows you to do that, allows you to look at your own religion and extract what was done wrong and what was done right, and try to work so that the morally right attitudes that happen throughout history and that needs to be happening in the present towards the future that Christ prophesies is the very own position that allows us to pursue the truth of God that sets us free. That Christ, in the same chapter that we brought, chapter 8 of his gospel, according to John, verse 32, says, know the truth of God, and the truth of God will set you free. So we are in the pursuit of this truth of God that sets us free and that Christ is giving to us. And it is in that pursuit that we look at history and analyzes with a Christian perspective, with a Christian view, to extract what is morally good that can lead society towards God, that can lead us towards God and towards Christ. But yeah, that was my point here in this argument that I wanted to discuss, and this attempt of every time trying to bring science as the one that can produce the absolute answer. But let me know what you think. Let me know your thoughts as well. Leave your comment down below, and I see you in the next time. May the peace of God be upon you.